You know, usually when we look at an ancient myth, we tend to treat it like a beautiful, fragile piece of stained glass. We hold it up to the light, we admire the colors, the poetry, the religious metaphors.
Right, we treat it as art, or maybe, primitive psychology. We look for the spiritual meaning and just assume it's purely symbolic.
Exactly. And it's safe to do that, right? Because it keeps our established historical timelines completely intact. But what happens if you take that exact same piece of stained glass, put it under a microscope, and realize it's not glass at all?
Right, what if it's a silicon chip?
Yes. What if you aren't looking at a poem about a chariot of fire, but a literal nuts and bolts schematic of an aerospace vehicle?
And that is exactly the premise of our deep dive today. We're unpacking Zecharia Sitchin's fascinating and undeniably controversial book, The Stairway to Heaven.
We're going to look at human history through an entirely new lens today. We're stripping away the spiritual allegory. And the mission of this deep dive is to explore every single chapter of this sweeping text, analyzing Sitchin's primary ideas.
It's an uncomfortable question he asks us to consider, honestly. What if humanity's mythological quests, like the Fountain of Youth or the Garden of Eden, weren't just metaphors?
Yeah. What if they were literal searches for physical infrastructure? Infrastructure left behind by, well, advanced beings who came from the stars.
That is the core of it. We often look at ancient texts as primitive fantasies. Sitchin argues they were literal journalistic accounts.
So let's dive right in. The book starts by looking at humanity's most primal emotion, which is the absolute terror of death.
Right, the universal drive for immortality. Sitchin starts in chapter 1 with the Garden of Eden. Humanity gets expelled, and the tree of life is suddenly guarded by, well, the texts say, cherubim with flaming swords.
Which is an intense image. And since that moment, humanity has relentlessly tried to find our way back in. We want that endless life back.
And what's fascinating is that Sitchin points out this wasn't just some fringe hobby for eccentric philosophers. This was a massive, state-sponsored enterprise throughout history.
Yeah, the geopolitics of this are wild. Like, let's look at the Spanish crown in the early 16th century. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella.
Right. They weren't just funding exploration for spices and gold.
No. The source details how they explicitly ordered Ponce de Leon to find the Fountain of Youth in the New World. And he wasn't looking for a metaphor.
He was commanding fleets based on highly specific indigenous intelligence. When the Spanish got to the Caribbean, they conducted these intense interrogations of the native populations.
They were demanding to know the exact coordinates of a restorative spring, right?
Exactly. And the locals talked about an island called Bimini, where the waters could allegedly reverse aging. Ponce de Leon was in his 50s, which was old for an explorer back then, and he fully believed it.
Because the indigenous accounts perfectly match the medieval European legends he already knew. It's like modern billionaires funding extreme anti-aging research today.
It is the exact same human impulse. They were just using the cutting-edge science of their era. And it goes back way further than the 16th century. Chapter 2 shifts to ancient Greece.
Oh, Alexander the Great. He was driven by the exact same paranoia. And he wasn't just out conquering for tax revenue.
No, the primary sources say he was actively hunting for the water of life in a place called the Land of Darkness. He diverted his massive military force into completely hostile territory.
Mimicking the journey of Moses, right?
Oh.
And Heracles.
Right. And he supposedly finds a subterranean tunnel, encounters a glowing being, an angel made of fire, and demands the waters to stop him from dying.
Yeah.
He was following a map laid out by myths he thought were hard facts.
Which brings us to the biblical patriarch Enoch. The text highlights him because he's this grand exception. He didn't die.
Right. The texts say he was taken by God. He ascends to the heavens in a moving cloud, interacts with beings he calls angels, and learns advanced astronomy.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Sitchin is establishing a pattern here. Spanish explorers, Greek kings, biblical patriarchs, they are all looking for specific waters, specific biological materials, and specific divine beings.
Beings who hold the technological key to endless life. But to really understand how these universal myths connect to physical monuments, Sitchin pivots to ancient Egypt in chapters 3 and 4.
Right, the Egyptian pharaohs and the pyramid texts. Now, mainstream Egyptologists usually say these texts are just confusing, metaphorical, religious poetry, right?
Yeah, they treat them as magical incantations to help the pharaoh's soul navigate the afterlife. But Sitchin completely reinterprets them. He says we have the genre all wrong.
He reads them as a step-by-step technical manual, which is wild.
It is. If you accept his premise, the pyramid texts describe a literal rocket launch. The deceased pharaoh journeys through a restricted zone called the Duat, the hidden place, to reach the imperishable star.
And the mechanical details are incredible. He goes through underground mazes and a place literally called the House of Fire. Sitchin says that's a radiation chamber.
Or a launch silo, yeah. The pharaoh encounters gods operating heavy sliding doors and complex locks. Not doing magic, but operating machinery.
And then he reaches the divine ladder, the ascender.
Right, and the hieroglyphs say this ascender is strapped together with copper cables. It says its sinews are like the bull of heaven, and it's operated by 4 falcon men.
Which Sitchin thinks are pilots in specialized flight helmets. And then the launch sequence itself, the Eye of Horus changes from blue to red.
The ground shakes, there's a roar like a massive storm, and the pharaoh shoots into the sky. Once you apply the aerospace framework, the imagery is stunning.
Traditional scholars see a magical boat. Sitchin sees a multi-stage rocket initiating thrust. He thinks the pharaohs were just doing an elaborate simulation of what the gods actually did.
Exactly. It's an incredibly detailed pantomime.
It really reminds me of a cargo cult. You know, during World War II, the U.S. military set up air bases on remote Pacific islands.
Right, and brought in all those massive cargo planes.
Yeah, and after the war, the military left. The islanders wanted the cargo to return, so they built mock airstrips out of dirt. They carved wooden headsets, lit signal fires along the fake runways.
They were perfectly simulating the technology they had seen, hoping to replicate the result. That is a perfect parallel to Sitchin's theory.
The pharaohs were pantomiming a process, walking down the gantry, putting on a spacesuit, strapping in, feeling the G-force. But, and this is my big question for you,
Go for it.
if the pharaohs were just playing in a cardboard spaceship, who were the original astronauts they were copying? Who owned the actual hardware?
To answer that, Sitchin moves into chapters 5 and 6. We have to look past Egypt to the ancient Sumerian texts, which are vastly older.
The Sumerians are such a historical anomaly anyway. They just spring up out of nowhere with advanced infrastructure, laws, astronomy, and they wrote down that the gods taught them all of this.
And according to Sitchin's translation of their cuneiform clay tablets, those gods were the Anunnaki. The name means those who from heaven to earth came.
From a planet called Nibiru, right? The planet of the crossing.
Exactly. A planet that orbits our sun every 3,600 Earth years. Sitchin states they arrived on Earth 450,000 years ago and built a space center in ancient Sumer at a place called Eridu.
Okay, but I have to bring up a major linguistic pushback here. Sitchin links these Sumerian accounts straight to the book of Genesis. He claims the biblical word Elohim, which means gods, plural, refers directly to the Anunnaki.
He does, yes.
But mainstream theologians universally say Elohim is just a plural of majesty. It's a Hebrew grammatical thing to show supreme power, not a literal group of physical aliens. How does Sitchin justify tossing that out?
He uses comparative mythology. Sitchin points out that the actions of the Elohim in Genesis read exactly like a committee. In Genesis, it says, "Let us make man in our image."
Right.
And in the Sumerian equivalent, it's a pantheon of distinct individuals arguing and collaborating. The Elohim were the Anunnaki deciding to genetically engineer a hybrid worker race.
And the Sumerian god Ea is the lead scientist. He takes early hominids, mixes their DNA with Anunnaki genetics, and creates humanity, which completely reframes the Garden of Eden.
It does. The tree of knowledge wasn't an apple that gave moral understanding. The knowledge was the biological ability to procreate.
It was a form of biological control. The Anunnaki lived for thousands of years, and they didn't want their hybrid workers to have that longevity or to multiply uncontrollably.
But Ea, who loved his creations, acted as the serpent in Eden. He secretly gave humans the genetic ability to reproduce.
The fascinating thing here is the moral ambiguity. The gods aren't perfect or ethereal. They have sibling rivalries, ethical disagreements over genetic engineering, political feuds.
They are very human. Ea's half-brother Enlil is the strict military commander. He thinks humans are a loud nuisance. And this feud culminates in the Great Flood.
Because the Anunnaki start interbreeding with human women, which matches the Genesis story of the daughters of men. Enlil gets disgusted and decides to just let humanity perish.
Right. Sitchin says as the last ice age ended, the Antarctic ice sheet slipped, causing a global deluge. Enlil orders no one to warn the humans.
It reads more like a sci-fi corporate thriller than a religious text. Enlil disobeys Enlil and secretly tells a human named Ziusudra, who is the Sumerian Noah, to build a submersible ship.
And that flood resets the entire board. The original spaceport in Sumer is wiped out under hundreds of feet of mud. the Anunnaki have to rebuild.
And humanity is deeply traumatized. We're hyper aware of our mortality and desperate to find the new aerospace installations. Which brings us to chapters 7 and 8 and the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Gilgamesh, the historical king of Uruk around 2900 BC. The texts explicitly state he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human.
Which is terrible for his existential dread. He has all this power, but that human fraction means his cells will degrade, he's going to die.
And he refuses to accept it. He decides to physically force his way into the land of the living to demand the anti-aging technology of the gods.
Sitchin makes a huge point here that scholars often miss. Gilgamesh makes two distinct journeys. He's not wandering in a fairy realm. He goes to physical, heavily guarded facilities.
Yes, his first journey is to the cedar forest, which the cuneiform texts call the landing place. He goes with his genetically engineered companion, Enkidu.
And they don't find magic. They find automated defense systems. They have to fight a mechanical monster named Humbaba. Sitchin says Humbaba had a sweeping searchlight that killed what it touched.
Right, like a security robot. And after they bypass it, Gilgamesh witnesses a rocket launch. The text says the heavens shrieked, the earth roared, it rained death.
He saw an aerospace vehicle taking off, and Sitchin points out that the Sumerian word usually translated as a name or a chariot, the word Shem should actually be translated as a sky chamber, a rocket.
Which completely changes the Tower of Babel story. But Gilgamesh's mission fails. They anger the gods, and Enkidu is struck down by a wasting illness.
Probably radiation poisoning from the facility. Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh has to watch his friend physically decay. It deeply traumatizes him.
So he starts his second journey. This time, he's aiming for Tilman, the land of the rockets. He goes through the Mount of Mashu, guarded by terrifying rocket men, or scorpion men.
Sitchin thinks they were guards in specialized suits with intense scanning equipment. Because Gilgamesh has divine biometric data, they let him pass through a pitch-black subterranean tunnel.
He comes out into an artificial biome and meets his ancestor, Zuusudra, the flood survivor, who basically tells him he can't have the gods' biological immortality.
Sitchin insists we focus on the geography here. If Gilgamesh went to physical places, we should be able to find them on a map today. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Chapter 9 identifies that first landing place in the cedar forest. Sitchin says it's Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon.
Baalbek is just baffling. Mainstream history says it's a Roman temple to Jupiter, but the Romans built on top of a foundation that is technologically completely out of place.
The foundation stones are inconceivably massive. The trilithon blocks weigh roughly 800 tons each.
800 tons. That's like 2 fully loaded Boeing 747s, and they fit together perfectly without mortar. We'd struggle to lift that with modern diesel cranes.
And local legends say it was built by giants before the flood as a launching pad. The ancient Canaanite myths talk about the god Baal secretly building a communication device and a launch facility there.
But if Baalbek was just a temporary landing site, why over-engineer it with 800-ton stones?
Sitchin argues the thrust of the Anunnaki vehicles was so immense that a standard platform would melt or shatter. They needed a megalithic, heat-resistant foundation.
Okay, so if Baalbek was the provisional staging ground, where was the main hub? Where was Gilgamesh's second destination? Tilman.
Chapters 10 and 11 tackle this. Mainstream scholars say Tilman was the island of Bahrain. Sitchin rejects that entirely based on the geographical clues in the epics.
Right, because you had to cross a desert to get there. Sitchin argues Tilman was the Sinai Peninsula.
Yes. And he delves into the search for the true Mount Sinai. He discards the traditional southern peaks, like Mount St. Catherine, because the Bible describes a vast, flat plain at the base where millions of Israelites could camp.
The traditional mountains are just steep granite. There's no plain there. So Sitchin points to a peak bordering the central plain of the peninsula, a massive, hard, perfectly flat, oval surface.
Geologically, it is the perfect runway for a space park.
The implications are wild. The Sinai Peninsula was forbidden territory. When Moses led the Israelites there, they were walking into the highly restricted zone of the gods. It's basically the ancient equivalent of Area 51.
That is a perfect analogy. An off-limits, top-secret aerospace installation generating rumors of UFOs and chariots of fire.
And strict physical perimeters. God literally told the Israelites not to cross the boundary line around the mountain or they'd be struck dead by lethal security defenses, not magic.
And if you have a massive spaceport in the central Sinai plain, you need a way to guide incoming spacecraft to it. You need indestructible navigational beacons.
Which brings us to chapters 12 and 13. Sitchin asserts that the pyramids of Giza were never tombs for pharaohs. They were built by the Anunnaki as visual beacons to guide ships into the Sinai spaceport.
This is a major revelation, and where he really breaks from mainstream Egyptology.
Hmm.
The massive scale, the reflective polished limestone casings, the precise geometric alignment, it was all functional.
He points out that earlier pharaohs built fake pyramids with empty chambers just to mimic the perfect pyramids at Giza, which were already there. But wait, what about Pharaoh Khufu? Mainstream history says he built the Great Pyramid.
Sitchin says we're looking at a massive historical scandal. The only evidence linking the Great Pyramid to Khufu is a single crude red paint cartouche inside a hidden relief chamber.
And Sitchin argues it was forged in 1837 by a British explorer named Colonel Howard Vyse.
Vyse had spent a fortune dynamiting his way into pyramids, finding nothing. He was facing financial ruin. So under the pressure of failure, Sitchin alleges Vyse and his assistant painted the cartouche themselves.
And the forensic evidence is amazing. Vyse copied the hieroglyphs from a book by John Gardner Wilkinson, but that book contained a known spelling error for Khufu's name.
Yes, instead of the sieve symbol for K, the book used the solar disk, Ra, so it's spelled Rao-Fu.
And the 19th century forgers accidentally copied that exact typo onto the pyramid wall. So what does this all mean? A typo altered global history for over a century.
And Sitchin points to the inventory stela, an actual stone monument that says Khufu repaired a temple near the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid, meaning they both existed long before his reign.
Mainstream scholars call it a fake because it ruins their timeline. But if the pyramids were just beacons, who is manning the control tower? You need a command center.
Chapter 14 reveals the Grand Grid. The Great Sphinx, which is way older than Pharaoh Khafre, gazes exactly eastward along the 30th parallel.
Pointing directly to the center of the Sinai spaceport.
Exactly. And the Anunnaki needed geometric anchors. Mount Ararat in the north, where Noah's Ark landed, the pyramids in the west, the Sinai in the center, but they needed a mission control on the center line.
And that exact geographical focal point is Jerusalem, specifically the sacred rock on the Temple Mount.
The navel of the earth. Sitchin argues it wasn't just a spiritual metaphor. It was the geodetic center where the communication and flight paths intersected.
The Holy of Holies was originally a heavily shielded aerospace command center. It seamlessly ties together Egyptian, Sumerian, Canaanite, and biblical histories into one cohesive reality.
It's a master plan. All these intensely fought-over religious sites began as high-tech logistics hubs.
It totally shifts our view of our ancestors. They weren't superstitious primitives making up fairy tales. They were meticulous record keepers of a reality they didn't fully understand mechanically.
So to summarize Sitchin's ultimate conclusion, humanity, driven by the memory of a golden age and the trauma of our own mortality, spent millennia searching for these physical installations.
The pyramids, Baalbek, Sinai, they weren't built by men for men. They were built by the gods for their own celestial navigation. But humans, seeking immortality, never stopped following the gaze of the Sphinx.
The ancient texts are basically their desperate attempts to preserve the flight manuals.
Exactly. We shouldn't view our ancestors as foolish mythmakers. We should view them as an orphaned humanity, desperately trying to find the doorway back to the stars by mimicking the technology they saw.
It is a deeply moving reevaluation of the human condition.
It really is. And it leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. If the Giza pyramids, the massive stones of Baalbek and the Temple Mount are the indestructible remnants of an off-world aerospace grid, what happens if the beings who built it decide to use it again?
The infrastructure is still sitting there.
Exactly. When you look up at the stars tonight, ask yourself, are we looking for them, or are we just waiting for them to return to the landing pads they left behind? Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into the source material. We encourage you to keep questioning the narrative of our past.